theft that reopens an old wound. Napoleonic jewels taken from the Louvre rekindle a long, awkward debate. Is it robbery or reclamation, when the stolen were stolen first? Paris. In a daylight strike that lasted less than 8 minutes, thieves rode a work lift up the facade of the Louvre, smashed into the famed Apollo Gallery and walked away with a trove of Napoleonic crown jewels. Objects that have for 2 centuries symbolized both French grandeur and the tangled history of European appropriation. The audacity of the robbery has left French officials scrambling to secure the museum's remaining treasures and a public asking an older, harder question. What do we call an act of theft when the property in question was itself assembled through conquest and plunder? The list of objects taken, described by authorities as priceless, reportedly includes crowns, necklaces and jewels closely associated with Napoleon and 19th-century French royalty. The theft forced the Louvre to temporarily close portions of the museum and prompted an extraordinary operation to move other jewels to the Bank of France for safekeeping. Arrests were announced in the days that followed, but the public reverberations of the raid have been cultural as much as criminal. For many observers in former colonies and among restitution advocates, the heist lifted a spotlight on a question museums across Europe have been trying fitfully to answer for years. Whose history is displayed behind bulletproof glass? In recent decades, France has faced repeated calls to return objects taken during conquest, colonial rule and imperial expansion. A landmark 2018 report commissioned by President Emmanuel Macron, by Felwine Sarr and Benedict Savoy, recommended the restitution of numerous African artifacts, setting off diplomatic negotiations and limited returns but also exposing the legal and political obstacles to a wider reckoning. History complicates moral clarity. Some of the Louvre's most celebrated holdings were acquired not by purchase but by force. Art and treasures pressed into French collections after the wars of the Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras helped populate what would become the National Museum. Scholars note that state-sanctioned seizures during that period, expeditionary trophies as much as cultural trophies, were a practice of their time, later enshrined into museum canons that seldom accounted for the vanished communities from which objects were taken. That history is now often cited in demands for repatriation. If objects were looted, the argument goes, the moral case for their return is strong, even if legal pathways are complex. The Louvre heist has given these abstract debates a new and jarring narrative framing. Footage of a basket lift ascending a museum wall, the shattering of glass cases, a crown disappearing into a waiting van, images that can be read through very different political lenses. To some, the thieves are common criminals who violated the rule of law and endangered a nation's patrimony. To others, especially in places that long ago lost cultural treasures to European empires, the theft read as a violent parable about ownership and memory, a provocation that forces public reckoning with what the term national heritage actually means. But the two positions are not symmetrical. The rule of law is the spine of modern museum ethics. Theft, private sale and illicit trafficking compound the injury done by earlier plunder, making cultural property vulnerable and its histories harder to recover. Legal restitution efforts over the past decade, from the high-profile return of certain Benin bronzes to Nigeria to diplomatic negotiations with countries across Africa and Asia, have relied on formal processes, provenance research and, often, political will. Those processes are slow and imperfect. An illegal theft, however rhetorically tempting as an act of reclamation, does nothing to build the institutions, archives, and shared agreements that make long-term repair possible. Cultural historians caution against romanticizing criminal acts as corrective justice. Counter-theft cannot replace restitution negotiated between states, museums, and communities, they say. It cannot repair provenance records, build museums in countries long deprived of their patrimony, or restore ritual and social functions that objects once had. Yet the heist has nonetheless amplified a basic public truth, that museums are not neutral vaults of beauty but repositories of stories, some glorious, some violent, that demand reckoning. In the weeks and months to come, investigators will pursue leads and prosecutors will build cases. Curators will re-evaluate security plans. Ministers will calibrate language about heritage and national shame. And in classrooms, op-eds and diplomatic back channels, the Louvre robbery will be invoked not merely as a spectacular crime but as a provocation to think about historical restitution in concrete terms. Which objects belong where, on what legal and ethical basis, and what structures are required to make return meaningful rather than merely symbolic. The moral knot at the center of the debate resists easy untying. If a nation's museums are partly the product of conquest and coercion, does that make the theft of those items an act of redress? Most legal scholars answer no. Most human rights advocates insist that justice requires lawful returns and institutional transformation, not theft. But public sympathy, as social media and street protests make plain, can be volatile. The spectacle of a crown, centuries after it first changed hands under a shadow of violence, disappearing in a burst of glass, forces a question that policymakers have long deferred. Can modern institutions built on contested histories ever be fully accountable without remaking the rules of ownership themselves? For now, the Louvre's broken glass and the missing jewels are a concrete loss. The conversation that follows could be the rarer thing. An opportunity to move from spectacle to policy, from outraged headlines to sustained, legally grounded repair. That, perhaps, is the only path that treats both the criminal act and the historical wrongs it recalled with the seriousness they deserve. What to watch next? Investigations and arrests, French parliamentary debate over restitution law, diplomatic responses from countries with claims to artifacts in French collections, museum security and insurance reviews. Sources: reporting from the Associated Press and Reuters on the Louvre jewel heist and arrests. Analysis and background on restitution from the Sartre, Savoy report and contemporary coverage of restitution debates in France and Europe.